Do you know exactly what it takes to engage in another fascinating conversation that warmly welcomes everyone? Life has originated on Earth? If you think about it, you might believe to some extent that Darwin's theory of evolution and chemical evolution can explain these things. But you're only correct to a certain extent. The reason is that explaining the origin of life on Earth and the evolution of life is a complex matter. Against the currently prevailing strong theories, there's panspermia. Panspermia, in its simplest form, explains that life came to Earth from outer space. So, shall we stay tuned? Today, we'll dive into a science-based, detailed, and analytical discussion about whether life originated on Earth and evolved, or if life came to Earth from outer space. Here we go. Let's start, friends. The human being is a creature full of curiosity, the most sophisticated trickster living on this planet. It's indeed this curious human who, through logical, enlightened, and scientific methods, has turned exploration into scientific discovery. Friends, one of the main aspects that this curious human explores is how life originated on Earth, what the origin of life is, and how we can observe such a diverse array of animal species on Earth. Various efforts have been made over different eras to explain these things. These efforts are what we call theories, friends. The oldest theory we encounter here is creationism. Simply put, creationism claims that all living and non-living things on Earth, as well as the entire universe, were created by an all-powerful God or several all-powerful gods. But if the entire universe was created by an all-powerful God, how did that God come into being? Where was this all-powerful God before creating the universe? And what was this God doing all that time? Simple questions like this leave creationism helpless, friends. And it's no longer considered a valid theory within the scientific method in modern society. It's truly an outdated theory in today's world. However, even though humanity has advanced greatly through scientific discoveries, there are still groups of people deeply attached to religious perspectives that firmly believe in creationism. Keep in mind, friend, that even in an era when the term science wasn't even known, theories like creationism were prevalent in society. But as humanity became enriched through science, it began to look at the origin of life and its evolution from a scientific perspective. That's when another theory emerged. Friends, spontaneous generation. In its simplest form, spontaneous generation explains that life arises spontaneously from non-living matter. But friends, this isn't like creationism. Spontaneous generation can be supported by many simple examples we see in everyday life. For instance, maggots appearing in garbage, flies emerging from discarded waste, or mice appearing from abandoned clothes. Various examples visible to the naked eye strengthen spontaneous generation. In fact, this theory became so deeply ingrained in society back then that it even caught the attention of the scientific community. It gained such strong attention that a scientist named John Needham conducted experiments by heating vegetable broth, sealing it, and observing it after a few days. He found microorganisms in the medium and declared that life arises from non-living matter. Because of John Needham's claims, the theory of spontaneous generation spread rapidly. But friends, scientists aren't a group that easily accepts what another scientist says without scrutiny. That's what we call scientific curiosity, friends. A scientist driven by this scientific curiosity was Lazzaro Spallanzani. In 1760, Lazzaro Spallanzani repeated John Needham's experiment. He heated meat and vegetable broth to a much higher temperature, sealed it, and observed it for a few days. Unlike John Needham's observations, Spallanzani didn't find microorganisms in his experiments. So, what really happened here? Spallanzani followed the same logic as John Needham, but heated the medium to a higher temperature than Needham did. What happened then was that all the microbial spores in the meat and vegetable broth were destroyed. As a result, no microorganisms appeared in the medium after a few days. The reason, as you might know, is that all the microbial spores were destroyed. This was actually understood even before Spallanzani in 1688 by a scientist named Francesco Redi. Redi proposed that maggots in rotting meat arise because flies lay eggs in the meat. Through such scientific experiments, the widely accepted theory of spontaneous generation was strongly challenged. Then, in the 19th century, the renowned scientist Louis Pasteur, through his famous swan neck flask experiment, experimentally proved that life never arises spontaneously and that life comes only from pre-existing life. He demonstrated that spontaneous generation is no longer valid. As a result of these developments, scientists began to look at the origin of life and its evolutionary processes from a different perspective. One of the key intellectuals during this time was the French scientist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He proposed Lamarckism, which suggests that any organism adapts to environmental changes during its lifetime. However, friends, Lamarckism doesn't explain how life originates. It addresses how life, once originated, undergoes changes over time in response to environmental factors, or whether life remains uniform without changes. Lamarckism suggests that life adapts to environmental changes over time and passes acquired traits to the next generation. According to Lamarckism, over time, only those organisms that successfully adapt to environmental conditions survive. However, over time, scientists identified the shortcomings of Lamarckism. During this period, from 1831 to 1836, a British naturalist scientist named Charles Darwin, who studied various species on different islands aboard the HMS Beagle, introduced a new theory called evolution. Friends, Darwin's theory of evolution remains one of the most powerful tools for explaining the origin and development of life. Darwin compiled his research findings and conclusions in a book that shifted our thinking to a new dimension, called On the Origin of Species. Through the observations of overpopulation and variation, and the conclusions of the struggle for existence, natural selection, and adaptation, Darwin's theory of evolution explains that humans, plants, animals, and all living beings originate from a single cellular organism. This scientific model allowed many things that Lamarckism couldn't explain to be successfully addressed. However, friends, this isn't where it ends. In the 1920s, the theory of chemical evolution emerged to further explain the origin of life. Chemical evolution suggests that life on Earth arose as a result of a series of chemical reactions during its early stages. A key scientist credited with this idea is Alexander Oparin, a Russian scientist who, in 1924, created a laboratory environment mimicking the gases believed to have existed on early Earth and conducted reactions to support this theory. Although not experimentally, Charles Darwin had already mentioned various ideas related to chemical evolution in his book, On the Origin of Species. Scientists now had an experiment, the Urey-Miller experiment, to test the origin of life. In 1928, British scientist J.B.S. Haldane demonstrated through experiments that simple organic compounds could form in a hydrogen-rich medium exposed to ultraviolet rays. This experiment further strengthened the chemical evolution theory. Now, let's talk in more detail about chemical evolution, the most powerful explanation used today to describe the origin of life. According to this theory, our solar system formed about 4.6 billion years ago as a result of the Big Bang. As a result of the Big Bang, Earth initially existed as a molten lava ball with high temperatures. Its crust contained gases like ammonia, methane, and carbon dioxide. Over millions of years, Earth gradually cooled, and the gases trapped in its crust, like methane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide, were released, forming the atmosphere. Water vapor formed clouds, leading to prolonged, heavy rainfall. But friends, keep in mind, these events didn't happen in a day, a week, or a year. This was a process spanning millions of years. This prolonged rainfall led to the formation of oceans and rivers on Earth. However, Earth was still extremely hot, with frequent volcanic eruptions. During this time, ultraviolet rays from the sun, energy from volcanic eruptions, and lightning caused the atmospheric gases like methane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide to react, forming various molecules. These molecules, friends, are called the basic building blocks of life. Over time, these molecules dissolved in rainwater and settled at the bottom of oceans. At the ocean floor, these molecules gradually concentrated and combined with others, forming larger molecules. These simple molecules transformed into complex ones, including carbon dioxide, amino acids, lipids, and nucleic acids, creating a highly concentrated aqueous solution called the primordial soup. Yes, it's a soup, but unlike the soups we see with meat, fish, or vegetables, this primordial soup contains various molecules. It's in this primordial soup that life first emerged. The organic and inorganic materials in this soup reacted and bonded, forming the first simple heterotrophic organisms. These were very simple, single-celled organisms. Over an extremely long period, these organisms adapted to various environmental and climatic conditions, evolving into the complex organisms we see today. That's what chemical evolution describes. But someone might think that chemical evolution is just a theoretical concept without experimental evidence. Initially, that was true, but friends, in 1953, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey created a primordial soup-like environment in a lab, exposed it to electric sparks and ultraviolet rays, and produced organic molecules, experimentally proving that life could arise in the primordial soup. As a result, Darwin's theory of evolution and chemical evolution are still used today as the most powerful explanations for the origin and evolution of life. However, friends, some scientists in the scientific community are reluctant to fully accept these theories and propose strong counter-arguments against chemical evolution. They argue that, relative to the timeline, the time taken for the first heterotrophic organism described by chemical evolution to evolve into the complex organisms we see today would require far more time. They also argue that for this process to complete, partially evolved organisms must have arrived on Earth to complete the loop. This theory, friends, is Panspermia. Simply put, this theory explains that life came to Earth from outer space. In more elegant words, life came to Earth from extraterrestrial sources. But don't get confused by the term extraterrestrial. It refers to the universal space beyond Earth. When discussing panspermia, two main questions arise. Who are these extraterrestrial organisms coming to Earth, and how do they get here? The answer to the first question is that partially evolved bacteria, viruses, and microorganisms come from space. Before answering the second question, let me briefly explain the origin of the panspermia hypothesis. The panspermia hypothesis was introduced to the world in 1980 by Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, an astronomer and mathematician, and Professor Fred Hoyle, a British astronomer. When their research team first proposed this theory, they faced two main questions. Are there really organisms in space? And if so, how do they get to Earth? Remarkably, successful answers to these questions have been found. In 2021, Chandra Wickramasinghe and Professor Fred Hoyle's research group, in collaboration with the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, began studying bacteria arriving on Earth through comets and asteroids in the upper atmosphere. Through this research, they found bacteria, viruses, and microorganisms in asteroids, meteorites, and comets that were previously unknown on Earth. A few years after this project began, a similar research effort led by Professor Milton Wainwright at the University of Sheffield found vast amounts of unidentified bacteria, viruses, and microorganisms in asteroid fragments and meteorites. More recently, scientists found microorganisms and water-based structures on the surface of the International Space Station, located 400 kilometers above Earth, which are not found on Earth. These findings confirm that bacteria, viruses, and microorganisms exist in space and can reach Earth via asteroids, meteorites, and comets. However, there's one small issue. For these microorganisms and viruses to reach Earth safely, they must withstand extreme temperatures, pressures, and radiation. Indeed, friend, in recent decades, researchers have identified numerous bacteria and viruses capable of surviving such conditions and traveling through space unharmed. A prime example is the Bacillus bacteria, which can survive temperatures as high as 420 degrees. According to the Panspermia research group, over 20,000 bacteria and viruses arrive on Earth from space per square meter daily. Additionally, the Kepler space mission's November 2013 report revealed that there are about 40 billion planets with Earth-like characteristics orbiting Sun-like stars, further strengthening the panspermia hypothesis. This suggests that life could transfer between planets in the universe. So, friend, according to panspermia, aren't we also extraterrestrial beings? Indeed, this theory has caused significant controversy within the scientific community. As a result, leading research institutes worldwide are conducting successful studies on panspermia, publishing numerous research articles, conference papers, books, and reports based on their data.